Here we go. So good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on where you are. We hope you're well and healthy and hanging in there. Let's crack on with today's fantastic webinar. My name is Sergio Lara Bercial, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's iCoachKids Shares live webinar. This is already our 13th 1-3 live event, okay? Lucky 13, we say in my country. I don't know in England. So let's see if it is lucky 13 or if the internet breaks. Thank you for making the time to join us today. We're going to explore strength and conditioning with the developing female athlete with two absolute leaders in this area, Dr. Stacey Emmons and Dr. Matt Wright. Both Stacey and Matt work here in England, Stacey at Leeds Beckett University and Matt at Teesside University. And I'm super excited to have them on the webinar today. You may also have seen Stacey featuring in our free online videos, which are available on our website and YouTube channel. So make sure that after the webinar, you go and check them out. But before we go any further, I'm going to hand over to our colleague, Gary, who's going to take you through the rules of engagement for the webinar. Gary, over to you.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Taking those line there. So just a few things. Please keep your cameras and microphones off throughout. But there will be opportunity to ask you questions. So if you have any questions as we go along, please put them in the chat and I'll collate them and then ask the presenters at the end. Remember that we're here to share and learn. We're all kind of gathering new information from new people. So respect the opinions. So we will hand over to Stacey first for a while, and she'll 15 minutes, followed by Matt, who'll present for 15 minutes. That will very quickly be followed by a conversation, a discussion with Sergio and myself, and then we will open up the floor to the question chat. Other than that, enjoy, and when you get the chance, also comment on social media, whether that be via our Twitter, our YouTube, or our LinkedIn.
Thanks a million, Gary. Thank you for that. So basically, today we're going to talk about strength and conditioning with the developing female athlete. Research has often described the strength characteristics of elite youth male soccer players. However, very little is known about the female players. The popularity and professionalism of female sport has increased markedly in recent years. In soccer, for example, the increased professionalism has resulted in the growth of elite female soccer academies for youth players designed to develop the next generation of elite senior internationals. As part of this increasingly professional training, youth elite female soccer athletes now regularly undertake strength and conditioning and have fitness tests regularly scheduled to test how these are impacting on their performance and their development. Both of our speakers today have extensive practical and research backgrounds in this area, so we're very, very fortunate today. I'm going to introduce first Stacey. Stacey Emmons works for Leeds Beckett University and is a senior lecturer in sports coaching and a very esteemed colleague. We've done a lot of work together, and I have to say, is one of the best people that I've ever had the pleasure of working with. Her main areas of interest are pediatric physiology, strength and conditioning, talent development, as well as the match and training demands of youth athletes. Stacey's current research focus is on the performance characteristics of youth female soccer players, but she also has extensive experience of working within elite sport. She spent 6 years at Leeds United, where she was the head of sports science for the Leeds United Academy, and she is the head of athletic development for the Leeds United Girls Academy, and is also the lead strength and conditioning coach for England Women's Rugby League squad. Without further ado, please welcome Stacey Emmons. Hi, Stacey. How are you?
Hi. Good, Sergio. Thanks. How are you?
Thank you very much for making the time today. I know you're just back from your holiday, so thank you so much for making the time today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can start sharing yours. And again, thank you, and take it away.
Okay. Thanks, Sergio. Is that working? Can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Thanks again, Sergio. Thanks for the opportunity to be part of this today. I think it's sort of really good that we're now getting sessions focusing on the female athlete. Oh, it's not on me. There we go. So I think kind of just building on, obviously, the point you touched on there in terms of the increased professionalism of female sport. We're now seeing increased professionalism of youth female sport, or the environments that they're in, and opportunities, particularly as you highlighted within girls football, where now we have academy structures that are very similar to the provisions the boys get at 10s to 16s. But as you touched on, the research around athletic development in youth female athletes is limited in comparison to males, and I think this kind of statement here highlights a lot of what's currently going on, where we're almost seeing practices that are going on in youth male sport around athletic development being directly transferred and tried to implement those in female sport. And while they may be right for the male youth athlete, they're not necessarily right for the female athlete, and that may be for numerous reasons, not just physiological reasons, but equally the context of those environments and the needs of those female athletes. So there is a real need to better understand the needs of the female athlete and what is the right athletic development strategies for those, and not just taking strategies we use for boys into the girls game and for girls athletes. So just to briefly touch on growth patterns with girls and boys, generally pre-maturation, so pre this accelerated growth spurt, which is highlighted by the two spikes on the graphs, we acknowledge that we can generally train girls and boys quite similarly. So pre-peak height velocity, so for girls, roughly around the age of 11, and for boys, probably 13 plus. We know we want to focus more around that fundamental movement skills, and adaptations are generally going to be neural and very similar for girls and boys. So our athletic development strategies are going to be very similar. However, changes that occur during this period of accelerated growth and development around maturation are different for boys and girls, and this is where we really need to start considering the specific needs of the female athlete. So in contrast to males, where we see that accelerated physical development, which is associated with a number of factors, but one of those being an increase in testosterone, which facilitates an increase in muscle mass and strength development, which is an important physical quality on its own, but it's also important for injury reduction and is an underpinning physical quality for things such as speed, change of direction, and power, which we know are important athletic qualities for any sport. In contrast, girls have an increase in female-specific hormones, so specifically looking at an increase in estrogen and progesterone, which don't necessarily facilitate that same athletic development. So that increase in estrogen is associated with an increase in fat mass in girls, which is potentially not advantageous in terms of athletic development, and we maybe see a decrease in relative strength qualities. That also facilitates an increase in widening of the hips, which is also associated with the onset of the menstrual cycle. So these potentially all have an impact on the physical capabilities of female athletes as they progress through maturation and then beyond into post-peak height velocity, that we need to consider when looking at long-term athletic development strategies. So just touching on some earlier research we did a couple of years ago, specifically looking at youth female athletes and specifically youth female footballers. We looked at the strength qualities of these players, again acknowledging strength to be an underpinning important physical quality for both performance and injury reduction. And in contrast to boys, where as they go through maturation, we see an increase in relative strength due to that hormonal profile conducive to strength development with an increase in testosterone. With the girls, we saw a decrease in relative strength, potentially, as I just touched upon, that increase in fat mass. So the body mass is increasing, but we're getting a decrease in relative strength. And importantly, the ability of youth female players to generate force quickly. So when we looked over these shorter time frames of impulse at 100 milliseconds and 300 milliseconds, seen significant decreases in their ability to generate force quickly, which is a really important factor when we look at injury risk profile. And we know that youth female athletes are generally more susceptible to knee-based injuries such as ACL and ankle injuries as they progress through that period of maturation. So that has some real implications for strength development and other strength and conditioning strategies as girls move through this period of development. We also saw when we looked at general physical qualities as well, so common ones that coaches may refer to if they're looking more particularly at team-based sports such as fitness and speed and change of direction. That's similar to boys. We did see a disturbance around that accelerated period of growth, so around peak height velocity, where they're growing a lot over a short period of time, which coaches may have heard to sort of referred to as adolescent awkwardness. But unlike the boys, where we generally see that increased athletic performance post-peak height velocity, which is why in the boys we see a lot of times maybe early maturation associated with increased talent because they display advanced physical qualities. In the girls, we were seeing a plateau in athletic development, or actually a decrease. Again, most likely linked to those different changes that occur in girls, particularly around hormonal changes, which impact upon physical development in post-peak height post-maturation. So acknowledging specifically around the need to develop fitness in this group. So we're seeing a trivial increase in fitness. So they need to have a specific stimulus in there. So they're not just going to naturally improve their fitness. We need to look to develop fitness qualities. Specifically within female footballers, we know the importance of the ability to repeat high intensity efforts to progress to senior football and beyond, and the need to potentially start actively developing that, and seem trivial to possible changes in speed qualities again, which potentially relate to changes in movement patterns, but also that decrease in relative strength. So that has real training implications for female footballers, which I'll touch on briefly, and I know Matt will go into in more detail. So just briefly wanted to highlight what that means in terms of talent ID and development. So again, why we can't just take our knowledge of the male athlete and apply it to the female game or the female youth athlete. There's an abundance of research, which I'm sure coaches are all aware of, around the relative age effect and early maturation in youth male sport, and particularly the huge volume of research around that in the male game, and the acknowledgement that we need to almost give youth male players time to catch up, and the importance of factoring maturation into our assessment of physical qualities to ensure that we don't just favour the early maturer. In contrast to that, in the girls' game, what we see is actually sometimes we favour a little bit more the late maturer because of the impact of growth and maturation on athletic qualities in the female player, which maybe make them slightly slower for a period of time. They may not move as well, they may not be as explosive. We sometimes attribute that to actually poor physical qualities, physical development, and we favour the early maturer. So there's just, again, that just is one point that highlights the difference in importance of understanding how growth and maturation may impact athletic development differently between boys and girls. And then just briefly touching on the injury risk factor, so acknowledging that potentially that decrease in relative strength being a risk factor for ACL injuries, but there's research suggesting as well that the changes in hormonal profile throughout the menstrual cycle, particularly levels of estrogen, may influence joint laxity, and that has implications for knee injuries, landing mechanics, and neuromuscular control. And where we see that spurt in boys as they get older and more mature, in girls we don't necessarily see that, and we see that decrease. We also see an increased reliance on knee extensors to stabilize the knee joint, rather than the hip extensors. So the implications of that in terms of the types of exercises we program from strength and conditioning perspective as well. So the need to really focus with girls on relative strength development, reactive strength, and neuromuscular control as they go through that period of growth and maturation and beyond as well. So I think the next step then is sort of how do we consider that in terms of the long-term athletic development strategies for female athletes, acknowledging in some contexts for female sports, potentially provisions and access to strength and conditioning coaches, etc., may not always be accessible from a young age. So I think the first step to consider is if we look at the theoretical models that are out there, and the youth composite model developed by Lloyd and Oliver, and there's the acknowledgement that we need to holistically develop the female athlete from a young age. So specifically focusing on physical development, can we expose them to a range of movement patterns, their ability to control their own body weight across a range of different planes of movement at different speeds? Can we include a focus on not just lower body? If we're considering the female footballer, they still need the upper body strength, the balance of pushing and pulling, landing mechanics, the importance of trunk stability control, acceleration, deceleration, etc. So can we target all these different qualities across the season? And building on the first table on the left is actually some of Matt's work. I'm sure he'll expand further, but this is sort of a strategy similar to what I've looked to develop within in my own practice, is looking when developing an athletic development curriculum is, can we have levels within the curriculum? So rather than saying an under 12 should be able to do this or an under 14, etc., is based on each player's individual development, because we know whether it's boys or girls, their journey through that period of growth and development can vary in timing and tempo. So can we have a curriculum that all staff working with these players can work from, so that players can be aware of where they sit on the levels of the curriculum? And then also linking that with some of the work of Lloyd and Oliver to have almost a theoretical process of decision making for how players progress through that. So can they move through that position? Can they hold it? Can they repeatedly do that? So if that, for example, might be a lunge pattern, or it might be something not pitch based, such as deceleration. And then can we look to increase the complexity of that movement? If they can do that, great, then we'll progress on to the next level. And if they can't, can we look at, is that something we need to correct due to some detriments in their movement quality, or is that some cueing? So this is just sort of the continuum then of what we look to consider. So pre-peak height velocity, can we look to develop a range of movement qualities through a range of movement patterns, and can players start to learn how to understand how to control their own body weight? Acknowledgement that, as I said at the start, initial adaptation is going to be neural. So can we get a lot of repetition, so they get to practice those movements a lot? But can we keep it fun, low to moderate structure? A lot with the girls within the Girls Academy at Leeds, try to give them some autonomy with that and get them to come up with some games as well. So can they bring their own ideas to little drills and games we can bring to the session, and the importance for them of understanding why and how this relates to their on-pitch performance. And then as we progress to Circa, looking to introduce some external load to those movements. So can they start to control their own body weight through under external load, with the acknowledgement of the importance of developing relative strength? So we start to expose them to actual strength-based exercises, introduction to the gym environment as well. And then post-peak height velocity, looking to increase that load, increase their ability to control that movement, increasing speeds. Can they start to sequence those movements together? Deal with more complex environments that may change without breaking down in terms of their technique as well. And acknowledging that as they progress post-peak height velocity as well, we're looking at more neural and morphological changes to start to occur as well. Won't spend too much time on this, just in the nature of time, but just an example again of developing curriculum whereby we have the levels and then progressions within that. So it's not necessarily, as I said, age-based, but based on each individual players, provides a framework that multiple coaches can work from, because within my context of the academy, the Leeds United Girls Academy, there's not only myself delivering on that programme, there's numerous coaches. So can we have a common curriculum that players can work from? And that might not always be linear. So depending on the stage of development, a player may move from one level to the other, but as growth and maturation impacts that, they have to kind of regress slightly back with that. And then this is just a real brief just example in practice. I know Matt's going to touch more on giving some clear examples of this in practice, but with a pre-peak height velocity group, focus on fundamental movement control, neuromuscular control, keeping that fun for those girls as well, with the hope that if we can build that foundation, give them the full athletic development toolbox, that as they progress older into senior football, the coaches working with them at that elite level can really refine those physical qualities, and they're not having to do some of that foundation work. It's already there in place. And then what we look to do with the older girls as well, circa and post peak height velocity, is supplement some of that work with some home-based program. So acknowledging the need to really focus on that neuromuscular control, landing mechanics, etc. We look to provide them with home-based resources and online resources to support that. So get them to look to complete a neuromuscular control program, which is about 15 to 20 minutes long, and an additional twice per week from home. And then just real briefly, just before I pass over to Matt to go into more detail on the delivery aspect, for those coaches working with the younger players, just wanted to sort of direct them to maybe this paper by Professor Kev Till from Leeds Beckett, which I think provides a really good framework for coaches to use. So using this RAMPAGE acronym for a session design, so from a strength and conditioning perspective, regardless of who we're working with, we look to adopt this RAMP protocol, so raise, activate, mobilize, and then potentiate or prepare. But acknowledging that with younger female athletes, the more we can start to embed some of these fundamental movement skills, and particularly neuromuscular control and landing work at a young age, where coaches don't specifically need a strength and conditioning coach to deliver that. We can embed some of those foundational movements and control, which allows girls to hopefully progress through maturation with better control, reduced injury risk, and advanced physical development, which we can then build upon post peak height velocity. So allowing the development of physical qualities, particularly in that ramp section, while still focusing on technical aspects. So here's just a real brief example of that, what we've tried to deliver in a rugby context across the England talent pathway. So this is an under 14 group. So in the top image, the girls working on some locomotor control, running mechanics within the raise aspect, while still working on grip and carry from a technical perspective. The coach leading on some of the activate and mobilize section, but incorporating some strength work, some body control within that section. And then introducing some acceleration and change of direction technique, while still working on some skill work within the potentiate section. So the more girls can be looked to expose to this within their skill-based sessions as well as S&C sessions, we're getting increased repetition of those movements, and that allows us to hopefully progress at an increased rate the athletic development work we're doing post peak height velocity, and start to load those movements to get those adaptations we need, and not necessarily just having to focus on the basic movement control. So just to recap from me before I pass to Matt, so just some overarching strategies to enhance physical performance. Can we consider the influence of maturation on physical performance? So monitoring that, but also acknowledging that we know it's going to be different to boys and the needs specific of the female athlete. Develop fundamental movement skills from a young age, but can we continue to reinforce these? So the importance of including these in warm-ups for sessions. Inclusion of neuromuscular training drills within training sessions, pre and post sessions. So that's a strategy we've looked to utilize at Leeds United Girls Academy. So we don't just work on running, landing mechanics and hops and sticks, etc. in the warm-ups. We also do them at the end of the session. So every age group does that at the end of every training session, which is coach-led as well. Because we know a lot of injuries occur when under fatigue. Yet what happens a lot of the time is we only practice neuromuscular control in warm-ups when players are fresh. So we've looked to include that for the last 2 seasons within cool downs as well. And that, I think we have seen a reduction in injury. It's possibly not only attributed to that, but I think that has contributed to the reduction in injuries we've seen, particularly around the knees and ankles. And then highlighting the importance of strength development, so particularly post-peak height velocity in girls, we don't get that naturally accelerated development as we potentially see with male youth athletes due to the different hormonal profiles, and we actually see a decrease in relative strength. So there's a real need to ensure within our athletic development strategies that there is an emphasis on relative strength development. Thank you. I'll hand over to Matt.
Thanks a million, Stacey. No, before we go to Matt, I mean, what a great start to the webinar, really, and a lot to digest, but really brings to attention a lot of really important points that we're going to discuss later. Stacey, if I can ask you to stop sharing your screen, so then I can, in a minute, hand over to Matt. While you do that, I'm going to introduce Matt. So we're going to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Matt Wright. Matt is a lecturer in biomechanics and strength and conditioning at Teesside University. He's an accredited strength and conditioning coach with the UK Strength and Conditioning Association, and also a sports scientist with the British Association of Sport and Exercise Scientists with bases for over 10 years. He's got over 10 years of experience in initiating, developing and leading sports science support to performance athletes in a range of sport. He has a particular interest in the physical development of youth athletes and has led the physical development program of Teesside Sports FA Girls Regional Talent Club since 2011. Matthew has published a number of peer-reviewed papers relating to youth athlete development, and his research interests include the assessment and development of fundamental movement competency in youth athletes and the long-term development of physical qualities in girls football players, as well as the quantification of training and match intensities. I think we're very lucky to have Matt with us today. Matt, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us.
Brilliant, thank you, and thanks for the invite. It's a hard on Stacey, really, but I'll try and do it.
Thanks, Matt. Over to you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks. Okay, so same problem with Stacey. There we go. So yeah, I'm going to try and build on really what Stacey's outlined, and try and give you some sort of practical examples, really, of kind of what we do at Teesside and how we try and develop girls footballers. So I suppose this slide take around about 10 years ago, where I started to work in girls football, and where you sort of got this challenge of taking girls through from under 10s, under 11s, and try and give them the physical characteristics to hopefully perform youth age group, or hopefully finally in the England squad, as kind of Beth's doing at the moment. And without a huge amount of research available to us at the time, and we're still limited now, but so we kind of had this challenge, and I suppose this is just accumulation of what we kind of learned on the way. So first of all, we kind of, when I'm putting a physical development program together, it's got to fit within the core values of the club. So the core values of the club are around kind of respect, humility, honesty, discipline, resilience, and togetherness. So we need to bear that in mind first of all, and we're trying to coach the person first. So that's fundamentally important to fit in with the values of the whole club. And then from a physical point of view, we look at the young athlete next, and then finally the kind of footballer at the end of that. That's kind of the icing on the cake, really. So for us, what we want them to be able to do when they leave the RTC, kind of 16 years of age, is kind of move well, which Stacey's talked a lot about fundamental movement skills, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but we want to be able to move well and to be able to be adaptable, so be able to do that in a variety of different environments. It's okay for us to be able to get them to move well in the gym, but if they can't do that on the pitch, then that's no good. So we want them to be adaptable to different environments, different timings and tempos, and that's some of the basis of the staged approach that Stacey put up. That when we get into the level 5s and level 6s, they're very adaptable to that. We also want them to understand that the training journey, so we want them to be part of that, and we want to educate them about the training principles and what we're trying to do with them. So when they leave at 16, if they don't have a strength and conditioning set up or anyone to help them, then they're educated enough to be able to move that on themselves. And really, I suppose we're trying to prepare them for what they're going to next, and to go into an elite environment when they're a little bit older. And most of all, I suppose we want them to enjoy the time with us as well. They're only kids at the end of the day, and we want it to be fun and enjoyable. So they're the kind of principles that underpin what we're trying to do. And then in terms of the training goals, and I use this model by Franco and Pellizeris, to kind of try and set and organize training. Well, we're working back from performance, so understanding what are the determinants of performance, or in our case, the physical determinants of performance for women's and girls football as best we can, and then using that to inform the training goals. So when we look at the literature, the high-speed running ability, or kind of aerobic anaerobic fitness, is perhaps one of the most important kind of training goals, because that can differentiate between levels of performance. So we know from some of Naomi Datson's work that if the players with the best high-speed running ability tend to be those that go on into international or professional setups. So that's an important area for us in terms of performance. Equally, sort of increasing that sprint speed or sprint capacity or sprinting ability, because we know that's important on the pitch. Improving acceleration, but also deceleration, and in turn, kind of agility. So from a strength and conditioning perspective, if we're looking to improve agility, from my point of view, I want to try and improve their ability to accelerate and to decelerate, and then their ability to move in space, which links into my fundamental movement skills. And then, of course, improving fundamental movement skills, strength and robustness. So we can focus on high running ability, but if we don't focus on fundamental movement skills and all the things that Stacey's just talked about, then we're probably going to end up with injured players at the end of the journey. So we really need to focus on this to be able to earn the right to do some of the other stuff. So that's kind of how we set our training goals, and I'll try and go over them in a little bit more detail. And Stacey mentioned the model by Lloyd and Oliver in terms of how that fits into long-term athlete development. So again, fundamental movement skills are an essential building block, but when we look at the model by Lloyd and Oliver, at the early years, fundamental movement skills are highly emphasized, but I would argue we need to keep that going for longer, particularly as fundamental movement skills are not developed particularly well in schools at the moment, and children are leaving primary school without mastery of basic fundamental movement skills. So you can't assume that the girls have developed these skills well enough early, and there's an argument throughout maturation that we need to keep sort of topping that up. So the thing I would say alongside fundamental movement skills is we can develop strength with those fundamental movement skills as well, and that might be advantageous. And we've just got some work that we're writing up at the moment that's shown in primary schools that if we combine strength training with fundamental movement skills, we might get a better improvement in some physical qualities and fundamental movement skill itself. And that could be very similar to what Stacey's doing, where we're working on body weight exercises, body weight strength exercises. We're going to get some neural adaptations that should improve both strength and fundamental movement skill. We want to work on speed and agility and dynamic movement skill, and I'll show you in a minute about trying to work in 3 planes of motion with our movement development. And strength and power, both concentric and eccentric, is important. And again, our work is very similar to what Stacey has presented in terms of we start to develop the maybe the loads lifted potentially as the athletes get a little bit older, depending upon their competence. In this model as well, we've got there's a kind of a highlight of hypertrophy is highlighted at around the age of kind of 11, 12, 13, and I kind of question that. It'd be interesting to get Stacey's thoughts on that, but I'm not sure how much of a priority kind of developing muscle size is at those ages compared to strength, neural control, fundamental movement skills, etc. And there's a de-emphasis here in endurance and fitness capabilities, which again I would question. And the rationale for that is the assumption that players will get an improvement in endurance and kind of aerobic, anaerobic fitness from training. And what we've found over the years is that football training and at all matches doesn't really provide within our group, and that might not be transferable to other sports and other groups, but that they don't get the right stimulus to improve fitness unless we do some extra work, and it could be running based work ourselves. But I would reiterate that really needs to be done on top of a good fundamental movement skill competence. So fundamental movement skills, and we've talked about these a lot, but these basically allow children to explore the physical environment and through kind of efficient movement, and they're not only linked to kind of the building blocks for more performance related training, but they're also essential really for public health. The ability to move helps us move more, and means that into adulthood then the kids are more likely to be kind of physically active, which is obviously multiple kind of health benefits. So it's not just about performance, developing fundamental movement skills, and one of the issues is that children don't really develop that particularly well at the moment within the PE curriculum. So we need to look at different ways we can explore it. An example on the picture is every so often we get the girls into the climbing wall, and we do try and do a number of multi-sports with the girls in the earlier, particularly in the earlier age groups, but really throughout as well, to give them exposure to different movements. And climbing is a great way of kind of developing certain movement skills, and sort of challenging the girls in different ways. And that's kind of almost a treat strength and conditioning session for them. If they work hard through a block, then we tend to get them on the climbing wall, or do some gymnastics, or do something a little bit different. So just building on, and Stacey's already presented this, but and this is her data, but she's talked about the increase in body mass as players mature, and the decrease in the ability to produce force quickly. And these are just really graphing what Stacey's shown. And what we do find is there's potentially an increase in injury risk as well, knee ligament injury risk, when we see this drop off in the ability to produce force quickly. So this is a key area of training we need to focus on. And this is kind of what it looks like from a landing mechanics point of view. So pre-peak height velocity, we tend to find landing can be reasonably good if we practice it. And with the younger age groups, we will spend quite a lot of time practicing landing, stabilizing. And sometimes as players grow, it can start to falter a little bit, particularly if they grow a lot, as this player had done. So we just need to revisit that and potentially regress that a little bit. And sometimes when players have grown quite aggressively, that can take a little bit of time. You can see how much harder it is to control that movement. So one of the key focuses for us in terms of training is kind of being able to put the brakes on. So when we're working on this term, this idea of braking strength and landing stabilization is really important. The ability to just stop, accelerate and then stop is quite important. Trunk stability and trunk control. Eccentric strength, so a really simple exercise is something like the Nordic hamstring, which can be done on the pitch. Just be very careful with the volume to start with if you haven't done that exercise before. But we use that quite a lot with our players. We'll work on dynamic balance and fundamental movement skill challenges, and trying to get them to control those movements, as I've shown you before. And if this works, I'll see if this works on here. This was just an example of a kind of deceleration drill. Other people can see that okay. Quite a simple one. You don't need to bring in the resistance that these players have got, but being able to stop and land into these positions are quite good. So we will work on that quite a bit, those kind of positions, and it can start from just standing and dropping into a lunge position, or being able to do a lunge. So I think Stacey had put in her presentation that about being able to find a position first. So if we can find a lunge position, if we can hold that lunge position, and then we can start to challenge it and drop it into that position, or accelerating and then stop it into that position. So that's kind of an example of how you can progress a fundamental movement into something that starts to look like something that's useful in terms of on the football pitch. We work on sprint development as well. And a couple of the key positions we might work on is this almost hip lock or A-stand position. Again, there was a good example in Stacey's presentation of players working on this position within a warm-up. So can we hold that position? Can we get into that position and hold it? And that can be as simple as working a lunge and moving into that position and holding. We'll work with the players on their ability to manipulate their center of mass and the base of support. I should say base of support. And the other area is the interaction with the foot on the floor, and that's where plyometric training might come in. Simple thing coaching can do, just such as skipping, will really help with that. So working on the springs of the body, and we use that for sprinting. So just focusing a little bit now on fitness development, and the need for it. Again, that using a bit of Stacey's data and some of our own, we find that over time that the girls do improve in terms of their fitness ability, but there's potentially a bit of a plateau with that. It could be that training rather than maturation is a key driver for this as well. So we've found periods where we've put in high intensity interval training, then we've got improvements in fitness. But where they go through the season, it tends to plateau across. So the pre-season period tends to be the period that we get the improvements in fitness, and we don't really get the stimulus throughout the season unless we add it in. And we really need to find ways to improve that. If we look at boys academy players, they're substantially higher than the girls. There's a big imbalance between the boys and the girls in terms of kind of football specific fitness, and that's much more than you'd expect between males and females. So it's an area we do need to probably look to develop, and particularly given its importance on the pitch. So we've done a little bit of work in that area, and there probably is, I think, a need for some specific conditioning elements to your training, some additional running based work, and that's not just getting people to mindlessly run around the pitch, but some intervals, some work at different tempos of running could be really beneficial. But really, in those players that have gone post peak height velocity, it's not something I would spend a huge amount of time concentrating on the younger players. We tend to find as well that if we're going to get an improvement, we want our session ratings to be quite hard for breathlessness. I'll show you in a minute how we monitor training sessions, but we ask them to rate their breathlessness exertion, and if that's around very hard for the session, then we're probably going to get an adaptation. But we do need to be cautious with young players in terms of this type of training, and the time's probably better spent elsewhere. We also just need to be a little bit cautious if we're going to put changes of direction into that training with players at peak height velocity, particularly if they're going through a growth spurt. So in terms of how we monitor that, we just use, there's a number of scales. We use the Borg CR100 scale, but there's a CR10 which is a little bit simpler, which works fine, and we get players to rate where they are against these kind of verbal anchors and then relate that to a number. And that's been shown. We've shown that's a valid measure of looking at intensity within girls footballers at these age groups, certainly at 14s and 16s, and it's a really simple method that can be used as long as it's done well. You do need to spend time talking players through it and making sure we're kind of challenging them and reiterating the process of going through this. Otherwise they can just pick a number, and we want them to not to really look at the numbers, to look at the verbal anchors and see where they rate the session. And we ask them to do that overall in terms of breathlessness, legs and upper body. And we actually get some really useful information from that, particularly for conditioning sessions where we might look at the difference between breathlessness and legs. So just I also just wanted to talk about this in relation to bringing people back. So we've got our first training session tonight on the pitch since lockdown, and I suppose some of the challenges are around that. And what we've done we've been doing sessions via Zoom, and we've got a system where we're getting players to rate their soreness on a 1 to 7 scale, the mood, the hydration, and things like that. And that's actually been quite useful, particularly asking for some comments. And I think the key thing here is knowing your players and getting as much information off your players as possible, which will help you, because we've got this situation now where we kind of know the fitness. We know where players are at in terms of fitness generally, but we've had this situation where they've been off for a long time, and some people might have been doing an awful lot. Others might not be doing much at all. So we could have a real disparity between where the players are at, and that's causes some problems for bringing them back into training safely. So in terms of kind of advice for that is trying to, I suppose, look at the bottom level and try and gradually increase things and take things slowly. We've always got we've got complications in youth sport in terms of understanding what the players do outside of our sessions and understanding the status of the players when they come in, and that's just been further highlighted with the issues around COVID and what's been going on in lockdown. So we just need to be aware of that, and what we want to try and do is get everyone to, you know, a kind of full tank really, so they're safe to go back into competition. So the more information we can get from the players, the better in terms of being able to plan training. And these are some of the issues for children throughout lockdown that I'm sure we're all kind of aware of, but just be mindful of that really. So finally, in terms of how we're organising probably the next 6 weeks or so of training, and how we're putting this all together, we have a technical theme for each week, and then alongside that there'll be some high-speed running capability work with the under-14s and under-16s. We'll probably do some repeated sprint games, relays, fun games with the younger age groups, and we'll graduate sprint efforts. So if players have not sprinted since 6 months ago, nearly maybe, since we went into lockdown, then we need to be very careful about getting them back into sprinting. So we'll develop that throughout the 6-week period. We'll start with 2 weeks that'll probably focus mainly on braking strength. We'll focus on acceleration, and then finally into sprinting in larger areas. But we'll always be mindful of that braking strength, even when we're moving into sprinting. We'll keep elements of this in. In terms of strength and conditioning, at the moment our gym-based sessions are all via Zoom, working with players in their own living rooms. So we're restricted with all age groups to kind of body weight, but we'll focus on eccentric control, landing stabilization initially. And we'll have a couple of weeks where we'll start to build some more concentric work before kind of a focus around isometrics and plyometrics. Again, that's not everything we do in the sessions, that's just the focus. And throughout, there'll always be some fundamental movement skills with strength, always be some general capacity, what we term in capacity, so calf work, hamstrings, trunk, and hip disassociation. So the ability to disassociate lower and upper body, we found really important for being able to move on the pitch. So we'll always keep some of that work in throughout. So finally, to kind of recap, the checklist for training for me is fundamental movement skills at all age groups, jumping, landing, plyometrics if the players are capable of it, and that could be as simple as skipping. It doesn't have to be we don't have to be doing depth jumps or anything too fancy, but something that's getting them to do some kind of plyometrics. Strength of hip, trunk, calf, hamstrings will be in there, particularly with the older players, post-peak height velocity. Not necessarily the younger players will get strength through the fundamental movement skill training. We'll always have some balance and proprioception work, acceleration and braking, and maybe a little bit of change of direction. Rotational movements. Okay, again, we're working in 3 planes of motion, so we'll try and keep that in. aerobic and anaerobic fitness. So that's kind of our checklist for stuff that we should be including within a block of training. And finally, within all that, you can get a little bit serious and bogged down, but it's kind of youth sport and we want to have fun. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thanks a million, Matt. That's, I mean, what two fantastic presentations, really. I'm normally supposed to be staying cool and writing down questions, and I was so absorbed and just watching you guys as a coach, really, and thinking, what can I learn from this, really? So amazing two presentations. I'm gonna kick us off with one question, really, one very general question, and then I'll hand over to Gary for some questions from the audience. Stacey, if you can open your microphone and your camera as well, and the same to Gary, so people can see the four of us on the screen, that would be great. I think it's kind of linking back to the last slide that Matt presented, really, but obviously, and like I say, so I'm watching this as a coach, but I've got also an academic background in this area, and I'm still thinking, there's a lot to make sense of here. Okay, so if we put ourselves in the shoes of a coach that doesn't have the equipment or the support personnel, or the academic and professional experience that perhaps we may have, and particularly you guys a lot more than me in this area. Where do we start? What should they be thinking of if they want to get started in this area? What would be your main advice? And I'm happy for either of you to take this question or take it in combination. Who wants to go first? It's a hard question.
I can start if needed with that. I think my advice would just be to keep it simple and the basics. I think we're kind of quite guilty, both as an S&C profession and just in general, of overcomplicating things. I think without even loads of other resources and equipment, if we just take the fundamental movement skills, which obviously both Matt and I have highlighted upon, there are numerous ways to challenge those movements without needing fancy equipment or load, etc., that will really develop physical qualities. And from challenging that movement, as Matt highlighted, from a lunge position and just doing that quite static, to then challenging that at speed, and can you drop into that position, which relates to deceleration, to challenging movement patterns by how you maybe enter and exit that movement. So if we're looking at accelerating and decelerating, for example, the starting position, so starting from a static position forwards on, to challenging that by moving at a different angle or starting maybe laterally, and just being creative with it, but rather than necessarily thinking I'm going to, I need to try and think of absolutely everything and do everything. I think coaches can't go wrong if they start with those fundamental movements and then just be creative and I think some of the best ideas of how to progress those I've actually got from the players, by saying to them, right, show us a different way that you can do that, etc. And like, children are so creative with their ideas, and almost giving them the opportunity to kind of, as Matt showed in his videos, that be creative with what they do.
Yeah, I agree with that. Start with the fundamental movement skills. I mean, if you're working with younger players, I mean, we use animals quite a lot. Animal shapes are really move around, crawl around like a bear or whatever, and just see what they do. Move around like a frog, see what they do, and then take it from there. But be mindful of the kind of positions that you want them to be in, and see what they come up with. Yeah, we've got some weird and wonderful names for exercises that tend to come from the players and what they've come up and called things. So yeah, go with what they come up with, but just be mindful of those basic movement patterns.
And along those lines, really, I mean, my understanding is that really you can get a lot of this work done or make progress with this in 10-15 minutes of your session. So we're not asking people to spend 90 minutes in the gym. It's just to use your beginning of the session or the end of the session, or a bit here and a bit there, to pull together 10-15 minutes where they are focusing on this kind of work.
Yeah. I mean, the beauty of fundamental movement skills is that there's evidence that they need to be taught, and so there's an element that you need to teach them these movement skills. But once they've got it and once they're doing it, they tend to mean that people are more likely to move more and do more anyway. So if you have 10, 15 minutes in your session working on fundamental movement skills, the chances are that that's going to help in terms outside of your session. So they're going to maybe go away and work on those in different ways, even without knowing it. But they're generally going to be physically more active and able to get into these positions. They're going to be able to move more. So whether they go down the play park and they're starting to move in different ways there, it has a kind of snowballing effect. So yeah, 10 to 15 minutes in a session could have a much bigger influence over the course of a week.
Great. And I'm going to hand over to Gary in a second, but just for the people listening, we have some great videos on fundamental movement skills on the iCoachKids YouTube channel. So I would really recommend people to go and have a look there, because you'll get lots of ideas really. And if you're not very familiar with the terminology, a great place to start. Okay. Gary, over to you. What's happening with questions from the audience? What do we have?
All right, we've got quite a lot actually, and the first one comes from Scott and is asking for a comment from Stacey around what are your thoughts, Stace, around bone health post, is it menarche?
Yeah.
With female athletes when considering external loading.
Yeah, so I think kind of it's really important that it's progressive in terms of how that load's been built up. So considering the training age of a player, so not just their chronological age or biological age. So if a player hasn't had that progression, so for example, if they haven't been in a structured environment from a young age and developed the fundamental movement skills and worked up, they always need to start there. But with girls that have those good movement patterns, inclusion of strength work is important in terms of for bone health as well as physical development as well. And I think the more we're starting to see it now within particularly girls football. There's a lot of media coverage around what the senior England team are doing when they're on training camps and in the gym, etc. And I think feeding that back down to the youth age groups is being really beneficial. I think it's always really beneficial to build education in. So we always try and get the girls to understand why we're doing things. So how doing that work in the gym and the strength work, how that relates to their performance on the pitch. And also sort of injury reduction as well.
Thanks, Stacey. The next question is for both of you, really. Slightly adapted from what Jamie's asked on the chat. How have the kind of home-based programs worked for you guys since the whole lockdown? So what Jamie's sharing is the story from his experiences in Ireland, where he's getting players at 15 that have got no strength and conditioning background. So how have you helped players develop those skills while at home at earlier ages?
I think we've probably both taken a similar approach from talking to Stacey anyway, but we started by giving them initially just some stuff to do at home. I don't think that worked particularly well. So within a few weeks, we kind of realized that wasn't working, and we worked out what Zoom was. So we've done weekly, so we've actually done sessions twice a week with the 14s and 16s, and one session a week with the younger girls via Zoom, and delivered strength and conditioning via Zoom, and then maybe giving them some challenges, and it might be a bit of running, or it might be an exercise challenge to do throughout the week, then, and feed that back into us a week later. But I think we found that when you're just giving information out, you're not getting any engagement. And I think what everyone was craving for at the time was someone to talk to, I suppose, when you're in lockdown, and that two-way conversation worked really well. And it took a few weeks to really get into the coaching and be able to do it online and kind of adapt to that. And it was quite a challenge from a coaching point of view, but that worked really well for us, where just giving information out was probably not so good.
Yeah, and I just reiterate, we've done pretty similar work with the Leeds United Girls Academy, so similar to my online Zoom delivery. And then on top of that, we also set up Strava groups for the running. Obviously acknowledging sort of some of the limitations with that, but just prescribing them some shorter efforts, sort of 1K repeated efforts, rather than sort of going on a 10K run for the older group. And all that automatically sort of generates a leaderboard within there. So there was a little bit of competition with the girls. And then we also tried to get them to coach as well. So little challenges we set were around, for example, can you coach someone through like a SWAT pattern, etc., film it and send it in, and just almost trying to educate the girls a bit with that as well. And I think the more for them they can understand how to do that movement, and actually by coaching it they start to see some of the things that are limited, and they can relate to that a little bit with their own performance, so setting challenges as well. But I think possibly a positive that's come out of the whole lockdown situation, everyone having to be a bit more creative, is obviously seeing how much online work can help. So I think it's something we've talked about within the RTC regarding potentially looking at periods over Christmas, etc., and keeping some online delivery over those periods, because we've just done an injury study both within the RTC and then at Leeds Beckett we've done one funded by the FA across all girls, or a large group of girls' academies, and we see spikes in injuries after Christmas and going back in pre-season. So we're looking at utilising almost online delivery of maybe just dropping it to once a week in those periods, because it's important for them to have a break as well, but bridging that gap between what we previously used to do was, as Matt alluded to there, giving them a programme to do over Christmas, and you know, we didn't really have much check on the engagement of that. So I think it has, out of a challenging time, maybe provided us with some ideas for what we can also continue to do going forward.
Gary, before you move on there, because I think the question from Jamie was also aimed about, okay, when you're giving people homework, how good are they at doing it? And you're saying that probably not very good. You have to be there with them online, but also how good are they at interpreting what you're asking them to do? And that I want to bring that together with something that Matt said before about, I think in one of your slides, you said that one of your objectives was to get the girls to understand the work, why they do it and what they do. And I think that's, to me, in my own experience, that's key really. If they don't understand it, even if they want to do it, they're just not going to do it, or they're not going to do it properly. Really. How much time do you spend, and what do you do specifically to get them to actually understand what it is that they're doing?
Well, one thing we do at the end of every strength and conditioning session, we try and get this in throughout and all the time really. But at the end of a session, we've always done a bit of a debrief where they can ask a question or we can ask questions of them. Because sometimes we get some players who ask questions all the time and then don't do any work. So sometimes it'd be like, that's a great question, but let's part that for the debrief at the end. And then we'll kind of discuss some of that, what they learned from the session, and we'll start to chat about it. And when we worked out on Zoom that you can click back on the link after 40 minutes so you don't get chucked off, we started to bring that back in, and we'll always have a bit of a debrief, and that's been quite good. I mean, we've had conversations about all sorts of stuff really. Some stuff nothing to do with the session, but it's been a good opportunity to chat to the players, and also a good opportunity to try and bring that education in. And some of them I'll start asking, oh, I've done this outside, or I've done this kind of running, was that any good? And we've started, it's like different conversations around what might be a good thing to do and why. And that's worked quite well. And I think they've enjoyed being able to talk to each other and spend that time with each other when they haven't seen each other for ages. And it's been a good opportunity to get some education in.
Yeah.
I think one thing we tried as well was, as we've progressed through Zoom, obviously initially you had that period where it was a little bit like talking to a brick wall when you ask questions. No one kind of gave anything back. But as the girls got used to it and we progressed, particularly over probably like the last month or so, we've got the girls to actually coach some of the exercises. So getting them, rather than it always be my voice or Owen, who I work with, if it's a certain movement pattern, etc., picking one of the players and they become almost the coach for that exercise, and getting them to coach the rest of the squad.
Yeah, we've done the same thing, and it's worked well. Started particularly, we've got some new players coming in, so we've tried to get some of the older players coaching the new players a little bit, and then we've started to even integrate some of the new players now to lead something, even if it's just a counting of an exercise or something like that. But yeah, that's worked quite well.
Excellent, thank you. Gary, back to you.
In questions from
Gary, you may have to come again, because
I wonder all the
Gary, you went into Robocop mode.
am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
excellent news, or for me anyway. So I guess combining two questions, Scott, who first of all asked, have these Zoom calls helped you individualize your program better in terms of you having more time with your players one-to-one? And then secondly, has it also helped players who might be catch up on developing these skills, who haven't maybe had the opportunity to practice them before?
Individualizing. For me, I would say we've probably less individualized through Zoom. We were probably more individualized before, where players all had their own individual program, were individually grouped. Well, we've got less options, I suppose, in Zoom and in a living room. So the players are doing more similar stuff. So I would say we're probably a little bit less individualized. But was the other part of the question about catching up? Some of the players being able to catch up a little bit.
Yeah.
I think the upside of that is some of the players who maybe were struggling a little bit with more of the fundamentals and the bodyweight stuff have actually catching up. And I know there's a few players that have said that they actually prefer the Zoom sessions to being in the gym. And then there's some of the other players who are probably the more advanced players as saying they're desperate to get back in the gym. So I would say it's brought everyone a little bit closer together. I don't know what Stacey's thoughts are and whether she's had the same.
Yeah, I would reiterate that. I think definitely positive in terms of it's allowed players to catch up. We've got some players who particularly were going through a period of accelerated growth who were really struggling at this almost in that period as we went into lockdown, and they've gone back to field-based training, and the coaches are commenting on, oh no, she's moving really well now, etc. And some of that obviously is what we've done within the sessions, but she's also just had 6 months to go through that period of growth and catch up as well. But yeah, I'd echo the fact that we've probably done less individualized work because as Matt highlighted, we're limited with what we can do when the players are just in the living room or in the garden. But that doesn't mean those players have really been disadvantaged, because I think sometimes they are so quick to want to progress on to the other types of work because they have gone on to loaded movements, etc. That they're not quite as focused on the warm-up aspect of that and those unloaded movements. So I think allowing them to do that. And one thing we've introduced more of is like mobility and yoga work. I think all players, girls or boys, don't really like the stretching aspect at the end of a session, or they're not as focused on wanting to do that type of work. However, it's really important both from a performance and injury perspective. So we've tried to embed more of that yoga type of work into the sessions as well, where because of the limited options they've had sort of in the living rooms, they've probably been a bit more focused in that than what they previously have when we've done it at the training ground.
I'd agree with that. I think the advantage of Zoom as well has been that they don't have someone putting them off and chatting, so they're all reasonably focused with that kind of stuff. It's worked really well. Another advantage I think of the sessions with Zoom that's been that you wouldn't have thought of is because you go into someone else's house, don't you, basically, and you start to then. So we've had I think a Zap the cat that I've tried to get an RP off. We start to like get to know, I suppose, other elements of the girls' lives that they might not tell you about. And it's been quite good in terms of building relationships, that you start to know the cats and the dogs and this kind of stuff. And I found that quite beneficial.
I mean, in that sense as well. Sorry, Gary, go
on, Serge.
I was just going to say, because for us, really, what we found really useful was, so if the session started at 7, we opened the Zoom meeting at 7:15. And then you could see who was signing on at 7:15 and was there for 15 minutes because they wanted to be there early, because they were chatting to someone else. It was just great to really have those 15 minutes of pre-session and just to let them, you take a step back and see what happens in those 15 minutes. And sometimes it was dead silence, and some other days it was like you felt like you didn't even want to start the session because the conversation was so good that you just wanted to let them get on with it. Sorry, Gary, back to you.
Yeah, I think it leads really nicely onto Dave's question about a bit of a wider context. So what kind of resources or examples of best practice or frameworks have you seen or have you used for broader curriculum delivery. So things such as life skills, positive youth development. Yeah, so what kind of have you come across?
In the context of strength and conditioning, right?
Yes, of course.
Tough question, that one. Don't know if you've got an answer to that one, Stacey.
I think kind of I don't think there's such ones directly within that we've used within strength and conditioning. There is a good model that, again, if you look at the work of Kev Till, he's got a decision-making framework around strength and conditioning, which I think can be applied across working with youth athletes, male or female, all the way up to senior. So I'd say look at that. But I think it's just always, as Matt touched upon in his presentation and what he just alluded to there about within getting to know the girls a bit better, I think it's always keeping that the person and the youth female, athlete at the center of that. So it's about, I think the most success we've found is getting to know the individual and taking that approach of they are, as Matt said, like it's getting to know the individual first, and then it's the athlete, and then it's the footballer on top, and that we always keep that individual at the center of that process, and they don't just become either a number in a spreadsheet or just lost in that wider group. And I think taking that approach and always then individualizing to their needs, but key to that, educating them on the why and trying to make it almost, I always think we've done a good job if we can get them to 18 plus, etc., where they almost don't need us. Like they kind of know what they're doing holistically, not just in terms of S&C, but their wider life skills outside of that, and can manage themselves, and we're just supporting them in that rather than leading that. And I think that's when we've done a good job, when we're almost they don't need to rely on us as much.
Yeah,
I guess
When I make yourself redundant.
Yeah, they're learning skills as well, right? So they're learning to learn. They're learning to take in new information and communicate with others in different ways.
Yeah. It's nice if you can get to the point where the player can write their own program eventually, which rarely happens within an RTC for us. But if we work with the players a bit longer, some of the girls will come to university, some things like that. You can get to them to the point where you hopefully become just a bit of a consultant, for them to bounce some ideas off you. Yeah, I think Stacey's right. I don't know if there's any particular models that you can follow for that. I'm sure there is, but I think the kind of philosophy of that, the person first.
Guys, I'm conscious of time, so Gary, I'm gonna ask one last question, and then I'm gonna close it off. Okay, but
yeah,
because we were talking about the psychological development of the player. One thing that you mentioned, Stacey, and then you, Matt, said it again, is that contrary to what happens to boys, that when they go through peak high velocity and through puberty, all of a sudden they go from they used to drive a Fiat Punto to driving a Ferrari, okay, and they improve naturally, okay. And I'm going through that at the moment. I coach 14-year-old boys, okay, so some of them are still in their Fiat Puntos, and some of them have got massive Lamborghinis, okay, and the contrast is huge. What's the impact on the girls from a mental point of view when all of a sudden they see themselves that they are perhaps slower than they used to be, that their relative strength has gone down? How do you manage that? What happens to them? Have you seen anything?
I think for me, what it goes back to again is always making the player central to what they're doing in their programming and getting them to understand that. So we talk about that. We do some formal education, some group work kind of with those age groups on. We talk to them about maturation, how it impacts them, and specifically one aspect with girls is getting them to understand as well the menstrual cycle with that. So I think, we're not at a point research wise where we can specifically say at this phase of the menstrual cycle target this type of work. Like while some people suggest we can, the research actually isn't strong enough yet for us to do that. But I think what we can do is we can start to educate young female athletes about that. And there's been a lot of good work in the media with senior elite female athletes across a range of sport, which can be drawn upon. But I think for us, and what we're moving to with the Girls Academy this year is getting the girls to track their own menstrual cycle. And we're not necessarily at a point where we're saying we want the coaches to ask about that, but the more we can, again, educate the players in terms of understanding their own bodies, that's going to help in the future. So we're getting them, there's a number of free apps that players can use, and we're just trying to get them to start to log their own symptoms. And then over a couple of months, they can see at times where their performance may be affected. If they wish to then want to talk about that, then we're trying to normalize that that's okay. But equally, we're not putting pressure on them to talk about that. And then educating them around, okay, well, we focus on what they can do, but versus what they can't do. So, okay, your strength might be a bit down at the moment, and we need to work on developing that. But let's look at always making sure by using that level scheme that while they may be dropped off in a certain area, they're progressing well in other areas, and getting them to understand that they will come out of that phase if we really do the targeted work there. So I think it's really important, as we've kind of touched upon throughout, in terms of educating the player and making them central to their own program.
Great. Yeah. Matt, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it, when a player's frustrated? It's I suppose it's developing your relationship with that player, trying to educate them, I suppose, as well, and educating them that they will come through this and they will be better at the end of it, but it's going to take a little bit of time, and that's always hard if you're a 13, 14-year-old girl, and you just want to play football, and maybe your skills gone down, or you're picking up niggly injuries, or you're no longer at the level you quite were a few months ago. Then that's frustrating, and I suppose it's just trying to listen to the player and work with them, and it is quite tricky, but you've just got to kind of work with them as best you can, really. And I think Stacey's right, kind of that education's key.
Thank you very much. Listen, I'm gonna bring it to a close. I don't want to take any more of your time. I know it's your first day in work, possibly, back to university, even if you're still working from home. So listen, thanks a million. That was an amazing hour and 20 minutes, really. I've learned a lot, and I hope everybody else has as well. Thank you so much again, and I hope to have you again on the let's call it on the show soon. Okay. Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Stacey. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everybody, for joining in. Stay safe and stay connected. Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for the invite. Cheers.
Matt, Stacey, stay with us for 2